You really thought you belonged in this room? Jonathan Pierce didn't raise his voice when he said it, but he didn't need to, because the insult wasn't in the volume. It was in the silence that followed, the kind that settles heavy in a $50 million boardroom where every chair holds power and every word can move markets. And right there, in front of 12 executives, he looked at Malcolm Rhodes' outstretched hand and refused to take it, not hesitating, not apologizing, just pausing long enough for everyone to notice before casually wiping. His palm against a linen handkerchief like contact itself was something to erase. And then he turned away, already speaking to someone else, already moving on, as if Malcolm had never been there at all, as if the man standing at the head of the table in a perfectly tailored but understated charcoal suit was nothing more than background noise, and no one stepped in, no one corrected it, because in rooms like this, power is often measured by who gets ignored without consequence, and in that moment, every eye made the same quiet assumption, that Malcolm Rhodes was the smallest man in the room, just another late addition to a deal he didn't belong in, just another observer hoping to be noticed. But Malcolm didn't react, not outwardly, not the way they expected. He didn't pull his hand back in embarrassment, didn't challenge Jonathan, didn't even shift his posture. He simply lowered his hand with deliberate calm and took his seat, folding into the silence like he owned it, like he understood something no one else did. And as the meeting continued, Jonathan took control of the narrative, projecting numbers onto the screen, talking through projections, acquisition strategies, capital flows, all while speaking over Malcolm anytime his voice even began to rise, cutting him off mid-sentence once with a polite but pointed smile. "Let's keep this to experienced voices," he said, drawing a few restrained laughs from the table, the kind people give when they're not sure if they should be laughing but do anyway to stay aligned with power. And Malcolm just watched, eyes steady, expression unreadable, as if he had seen this exact scene play out before, because he had, more times than anyone in that room could imagine. At 22, when his first proposal was dismissed before he finished speaking. At 29, when a firm told him he didn't fit their profile. At 35, when he was invited into rooms like this only to be overlooked inside them. And now here he was again, older, sharper, quieter, sitting in a chair that technically wasn't even listed on the agenda, his name absent from the printed sheets in front of every executive, a detail Jonathan had made sure of, because exclusion doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like omission, like silence, like pretending someone doesn't exist long enough that eventually everyone else believes it too. But Malcolm didn't interrupt, didn't defend himself, didn't try to earn space in a room that had already decided he didn't deserve it. Instead, he leaned back slightly, fingertips resting together, gaze drifting briefly to the reflection of himself in the polished glass wall behind the table. And for just a moment, time slowed, not for the room, but for him, because this wasn't new, this wasn't unexpected, this was familiar, almost routine, and familiarity doesn't create anger, it creates clarity, and clarity doesn't shout, it calculates. And somewhere between Jonathan's third projection slide and his fourth dismissive glance, Malcolm reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and without drawing attention, without shifting the energy of the room even slightly, he tapped a single contact and spoke just loud enough for one person on the other end to hear. "Naomi," he said, voice calm, measured, almost effortless, initiate Blackstone sequence. And then he set the phone back down, folded his hands again, and looked up at Jonathan Pierce as if nothing had happened at all, as if the meeting were still exactly what everyone thought it was. But in reality, something had already started moving beneath the surface, something none of them could see yet. Something that wouldn't ask for attention, wouldn't announce itself, wouldn't interrupt, it would simply arrive. And when it did, the room would finally understand that the man they chose to ignore had been the only one in control the entire time. The room did not change right away, and that was the most dangerous part, because nothing ever looks different at the beginning of a collapse. It still feels controlled, still feels predictable, and Jonathan Pierce continued speaking as if the air had not shifted, as if the quiet man at the end of the table had not just set something irreversible into motion, his voice steady, confident, outlining projections in clean percentages, talking about capital efficiency and long-term positioning. while the screen behind him displayed numbers that impressed everyone except the one person who already knew how fragile they were. And Malcolm Rhodes sat there unmoved, his eyes no longer following the presentation, but instead observing the room itself, the subtle hierarchies, the way people leaned toward Jonathan when he spoke, the way they avoided looking at Malcolm too long, as if acknowledging him might disrupt the balance they believed in. And across the table, a young analyst named Sophie Lynn shifted in her seat, her gaze flickering between Malcolm and the access panel on her tablet, because something did not align, something small but precise. Malcolm's credentials had appeared in the system moments earlier with a level of clearance she had only ever seen attached to executive override accounts, the kind that did not get questioned, the kind that did not need introduction, and yet here he was, unintroduced, unacknowledged, and that contradiction sat heavy in her mind. While Jonathan clicked to the next slide and smiled. Now, as you can see, our liquidity position is stronger than ever, he said, tapping the screen, confident, certain, until the first phone buzzed, soft, almost polite, a vibration against polished wood, easy to ignore, except it did not stop, and then another followed, and another, a ripple of interruptions that moved across the table like a quiet wave. Executives glancing down, brows tightening, screens lighting up with notifications they did not expect, and Jonathan paused just briefly, just long enough to register the shift, before continuing, attempting to hold control, but control is fragile when it depends on information, and information had just begun to change, and Sophie looked down at her own screen, her breath catching as she read the alert in full. Liquidity threshold alert, margin exposure exceeded, automated rebalancing initiated, and she blinked, refreshing once, twice, thinking it was an error, but the numbers updated in real time, moving fast, too fast, and across from her. Another executive whispered under his breath, "That cannot be right," while Jonathan's phone buzzed again, louder, this time against the table, drawing his attention despite himself, and he picked it up, irritation flickering across his face before it shifted into something else, something tighter, something less certain, his thumb scrolling, eyes narrowing as the message expanded, and Malcolm watched him, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with the same calm he had carried since the moment he entered the room. Because this was never about reaction, it was about timing, and timing does not rush. It arrives exactly when it is supposed to, and Jonathan cleared his throat, attempting to regain momentum. "We will address any minor fluctuations shortly," he said, though his voice had lost a fraction of its certainty, a detail small enough that most people would miss it, but not Malcolm, never Malcolm, because he had spent decades learning that power does not disappear all at once. It fractures in subtle ways first, in tone, in posture, in the space between words, and now that fracture had begun, invisible to most, undeniable to those paying attention, and Sophie looked up again, this time directly at Malcolm, her expression no longer uncertain but alert, because she understood now that whatever was happening was not random, it was precise, structured, intentional, and Malcolm met her gaze for just a second, a silent acknowledgement, not of her, but of the truth she had just uncovered, before his attention returned to Jonathan Pierce, who was now refreshing his screen again. Faster this time, the numbers continuing to shift, the foundation beneath his confidence beginning to move, and for the first time since the meeting began, the man who controlled the room was no longer fully in control, even if he had not yet realized why. By the time the third alert came through, the room could no longer pretend nothing was happening, because silence had been replaced with tension, and tension has a sound. It lives in the shifting of chairs, the tapping of screens, the quiet breaths people take when they realize something is no longer under control, and Jonathan Pierce felt it now, not fully, not completely, but enough to interrupt his own rhythm, enough to stop mid-sentence and glance down again as his phone lit up with another notification, this one longer, more detailed, harder to dismiss, and he read it twice before locking his jaw, before forcing a thin smile back onto his face. "Give me just a moment," he said, though the words came slower than before, as if each one needed to be placed carefully to avoid revealing what was already beginning to show, and across the table, executives were no longer looking at the screen. They were looking at their own devices, their own alerts, comparing numbers, refreshing data, feeds that should not have been moving this fast. Because portfolios at this level do not shift in seconds. They do not unravel in real time unless something deeper has been triggered, something systemic, and Sophie Lynn felt it in her chest now. That quiet certainty turning into something sharper, because the alerts were not random, they were synchronized, cascading through interconnected accounts, each one tied to a central structure she had only studied in theory, never witnessed in motion. And her eyes moved again to Malcolm Rhodes, who had not checked his phone once since placing it down, not once, as if he already knew exactly what every alert would say before it appeared. And that was when Jonathan stood, not abruptly, but not smoothly either, a motion caught somewhere between control and urgency. "There seems to be a temporary discrepancy," he said, his voice firm but thinner now, stretched across something he could not fully contain. "We will pause for 5 minutes." And no one objected, because no one could, because whatever was happening had already taken priority over the meeting itself. And as people began to stand, to step aside, to whisper in low tones, Malcolm remained seated for a moment longer, watching Jonathan, who had turned away from the table, his back now partially exposed, his posture tighter, shoulders slightly raised as he scrolled through messages that no longer looked manageable. And Malcolm's gaze did not waver, because this moment, this exact shift from confidence to uncertainty, was the real turning point, not the alerts, not the numbers, but the realization forming behind Jonathan's eyes that something he controlled was no longer his. And then Malcolm stood, smooth, unhurried, adjusting his cuff as if the room still belonged to him in the same quiet way it always had. And as he stepped forward, just enough to close the distance, just enough for his voice to reach Jonathan without needing to rise, he spoke, calm and precise. "You should sit back down," he said, not as a suggestion, not as a warning, but as a statement of fact. And Jonathan turned, confusion flickering across his face, irritation trying to follow but failing to fully land, because something in Malcolm's tone did not invite dismissal, did not allow it. And for a second, just a second, the room stilled again, not in the same way it had at the beginning, but differently now, heavier, charged, as if everyone present could feel that whatever had just begun was about to be explained, and none of them were going to like the answer. Jonathan did not sit down, not at first, because men like him did not respond to quiet authority. They responded to dominance, to volume, to force, and Malcolm had offered none of that, just a calm sentence placed in the air like it already belonged there. And for a brief moment Jonathan tried to reclaim the room the only way he knew how, by straightening his posture, by tightening his grip on the phone in his hand, by forcing a dismissive breath through his nose as if whatever was happening could still be reduced to a minor disruption. "I think you are out of line," he said, turning slightly so others could hear, trying to pull the room back into alignment with him. But the words did not land the way they had earlier. They did not carry the same weight, because the room had already shifted, and people were no longer looking at him for direction. They were looking at their screens, at each other, at Malcolm, and that was the first signal that control had moved. Not completely, not yet, but enough that it could not be ignored. And Malcolm did not raise his voice, did not step closer. He simply held Jonathan's gaze with a level stillness that made everything else feel unstable by comparison. "You are not dealing with a discrepancy," Malcolm said, each word measured, deliberate. "You are dealing with a system response." And Jonathan frowned, confusion breaking through his irritation, because the phrasing was wrong, too specific, too certain. And before he could respond, another executive spoke up from across the table, his voice tight, almost strained. "My account just triggered a forced rebalance," he said, eyes locked on his tablet. "That does not happen without a primary event." And another voice followed, overlapping, "Same here." And another, "Mine too." The pattern becoming undeniable, spreading across the room in real time. And Jonathan's phone buzzed again, louder now, persistent, no longer ignorable. And when he looked down this time, the message was different, not an alert, not a warning, but a confirmation, asset liquidation sequence active. And for the first time, the confidence left his face completely, replaced by something sharper, something closer to realization. And he looked up at Malcolm, really looked this time, not past him, not through him, but at him, as if trying to reconcile the quiet man in front of him with the scale of what was unfolding. And Malcolm gave him nothing except clarity, no emotion, no satisfaction, just truth delivered without effort. You built your position on layered capital, Malcolm continued, his voice steady. Multiple funds, interlinked exposure, leveraged across networks you do not fully control. And Jonathan's jaw tightened, because that was accurate, too accurate, information that was not public, not shared in rooms like this. And yet Malcolm spoke it like a summary, like a file he had already reviewed, and Sophie's breath caught as she listened, because she understood now, fully, completely. The structure she had only studied was not theoretical in this moment. It was active, and Malcolm was not reacting to it. He was directing it. And Jonathan shook his head slightly, almost reflexively, as if denial could slow what was already happening. That is not possible, he said. But the words sounded weaker than he intended, because his phone buzzed again. And this time he did not check it immediately, as if looking might confirm something he was not ready to face. And Malcolm tilted his head just slightly, not in challenge, but in quiet correction. It already happened, he said, and the room fell silent again, not out of politeness, not out of uncertainty, but because everyone present could feel it now, the exact moment when power changes hands, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that leaves no space for argument. And Jonathan Pierce, who had walked into that room believing he controlled everything in it, was beginning to understand that he had never been the one in control at all. No one spoke after that, not immediately, because the weight of what Malcolm had just said did not invite interruption. It demanded processing. And in rooms like this, where power is usually loud and fast and visible, this kind of quiet certainty felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling. And Jonathan Pierce stood there with his phone still in his hand, no longer pretending, no longer trying to redirect the room, because every new vibration in his palm confirmed what he was beginning to understand. That this was not a glitch, not a temporary disruption, but a controlled sequence unfolding exactly as designed. And he finally looked down again, slower this time, almost reluctant, his thumb hovering for a fraction of a second before unlocking the screen. And when he read the latest update, his expression changed in a way no one in the room had seen before. Not anger, not arrogance, but calculation breaking under pressure. The kind of expression that appears when someone realizes the rules they have been playing by no longer apply. And across the table, one of the senior partners leaned forward, voice low but sharp. "Jonathan, what is happening?" he asked, not as a question, but as a demand for clarity. And Jonathan did not answer right away, because he did not have one that would preserve his authority. And that silence, that hesitation, echoed louder than anything he had said all morning. And Malcolm stepped slightly to the side, not to dominate the space, but to redefine it, his presence now impossible to ignore, no longer the man at the edge of the table, but the center of the moment itself. And when he spoke again, it was not to explain everything, just enough to remove doubt. "Your positions are being unwound," he said, calm, precise, not by the market, not by chance, but by access. And the word landed differently, because access is not something you lose accidentally at this level. It is something that is taken, and Sophie felt it click fully into place now. The alerts, the synchronization, the timing, all of it tied to a central authority that had the power to move across multiple financial layers without resistance. And her eyes widened slightly as she realized what that meant, because there were only a handful of entities in the country capable of that kind of reach, and none of them operated without intent. And Jonathan shook his head again, quieter this time, almost to himself. "You cannot do that," he said. But even he did not sound convinced anymore, because his screen updated again. And this time the numbers were not fluctuating, they were dropping, positions closing, assets converting, liquidity being forced into motion whether he agreed or not. And Malcolm watched him with the same steady gaze, not enjoying it, not reacting to it, just allowing the reality to arrive. "You built your portfolio on borrowed pathways," Malcolm continued, his tone even. "You assumed those pathways would always be open." And Jonathan's grip tightened slightly around his phone, because that was exactly what he had assumed, that the systems he used, the networks he leveraged, the capital he moved through layers and layers of structure would always respond to him, always serve him, always remain under his influence, and now, in real time, those same systems were turning, not against him, but away from him, responding to a higher authority he had not accounted for. And the room watched, silent, as the shift completed itself, not all at once, but enough that no one could deny it anymore. And Malcolm took one final step forward, just enough that his presence filled the space Jonathan had tried to control, and with a voice that did not rise, did not need to, he said, "You did not just refuse a handshake." He paused, letting the words settle, letting the room lean into the meaning before he finished. "You refused the only person in this room who could have kept your system intact." And this time, no one looked away, because everyone understood exactly what that meant. Jonathan did not respond right away, not because he did not have words, but because none of the words he had would restore what had just been lost. And for the first time since the meeting began, he was no longer the one shaping the narrative. He was reacting to it, and that shift was visible to everyone in the room, in the way his shoulders no longer squared forward, in the way his eyes kept returning to the screen in his hand, as if hoping the numbers would correct themselves. But they did not. They continued moving in one direction, consistent, controlled, irreversible, and across the table. The senior partner who had questioned him earlier leaned back slowly, his expression no longer demanding answers, but searching for understanding, because what was unfolding was no longer a private issue. It was systemic. It affected every layer connected to Jonathan's structure, and that realization spread through the room like a quiet current, each person recalculating their own exposure, their own position, their own proximity to what was now clearly a controlled collapse. And Malcolm Rhodes stood in the center of that realization without raising his presence, without claiming attention, because he did not need to. The system itself was speaking for him. Every alert, every notification, every shifting number reinforcing the same truth. And Jonathan finally exhaled, a slow breath that carried more weight than anything he had said before. "What do you want?" he asked, and the question was different from anything he had asked all day. It was not dismissive, not rhetorical. It was direct, almost restrained, because beneath it was the understanding that this was no longer about perception. It was about leverage, and Malcolm looked at him for a moment, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, as if the answer had never been complicated. "I wanted respect," he said, his voice steady, grounded. Not recognition, not approval, just basic acknowledgement. And the simplicity of it landed harder than any threat could have, because it reframed everything that had just happened, not as an attack, not as an act of aggression, but as a consequence. And Jonathan's expression tightened slightly, because that was not a demand he could negotiate. It was one he had already failed. And around them, the room remained silent, no one interrupting, no one stepping in, because this was no longer a meeting. It was a reckoning unfolding in real time. And Malcolm continued, not raising his voice, not needing emphasis. "You dismissed me before you knew who I was," he said. "You decided my value based on what you saw, not what I controlled." And Jonathan looked down again, not out of avoidance, but because the screen in his hand was now confirming exactly what Malcolm was saying, that the systems he relied on, the networks he trusted, the capital he believed was firmly under his influence were all connected to something larger, something he had overlooked. And Malcolm took a slow breath, not as a pause, but as a transition. "Power does not always introduce itself," he said. "Sometimes it sits quietly and lets you reveal how you treat it." And the words settled into the room with a weight that could not be ignored, because every person present had witnessed it, had participated in it through silence, through assumption, through alignment with the wrong side of a moment they did not fully understand. And Jonathan's voice, when it came again, was lower, more controlled, but unmistakably changed. "Stop it," he said, not as a command, but as a request. And that difference was everything, because it confirmed what the room already knew. That control had shifted completely, and Malcolm held his gaze for a second longer before answering. Not immediately, not impulsively, but with the same measured precision that had guided every move so far. "It does not stop because you asked," he said. "It stops when the system completes what it was designed to do." And for the first time, Jonathan Pierce had no response at all. The room did not move, not physically, but everything inside it had shifted, And that kind of shift does not come with noise. It comes with realization, the kind that settles slowly into every person present, forcing them to reevaluate what they thought they understood just minutes ago. And Jonathan Pierce stood there with the weight of that realization pressing in from all sides, his phone still active in his hand, still updating, still confirming what Malcolm had already made clear, that this was not something he could stop, not something he could negotiate his way out of, because negotiation requires leverage, and leverage was no longer his. And across the table, one of the executives who had laughed earlier now sat completely still, eyes fixed on Malcolm, as if trying to piece together how someone he had dismissed so easily had just taken control of a system that none of them could even access. And Sophie Lynn did not look at her screen anymore. She did not need to, because she understood the pattern now. She understood that this was not a reaction. It was a pre-structured sequence, something designed long before this meeting ever began, something that had been waiting for a trigger, and that trigger had not been a financial misstep or a market shift. It had been a moment, a decision, a refusal, and Malcolm stood in the center of it all with the same calm presence he had carried from the beginning. Not expanding, not escalating, just existing in a way that now commanded attention without asking for it. And Jonathan finally lowered his phone slightly, not because the alerts had stopped, but because continuing to look at them would not change what they said. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more controlled, but stripped of the certainty it once carried. "You planned this," he said, and it was not an accusation, it was a realization forming in real time, and Malcolm did not deny it, did not confirm it directly either. He simply met Jonathan's gaze and said, "I prepared for possibilities." And the distinction mattered, because preparation is not aggression, it is awareness. It is understanding how systems behave when pressure is applied. And Jonathan let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly, as if trying to reconcile the scale of what was happening with the simplicity of how it had started. A single moment, a single choice, a handshake refused without thought. And Malcolm continued, not to lecture, not to dominate, but to complete the picture. "You operate in a network," he said, "one that depends on trust, access, and recognition." And Jonathan's jaw tightened again, because that was the foundation of everything he had built. And Malcolm took one small step closer, not invading space, but clarifying position. "When you remove respect from that network," he said, "you create instability." And the room absorbed the words in silence, because they were no longer theoretical. They were visible, measurable, unfolding in real time across every screen in the room. And Jonathan looked around briefly, not for support, but to confirm what he already knew, that no one could help him here, that no one in this room had the authority to reverse what had been set in motion. And that realization settled deeper than any lost number could, because it was not just about capital, it was about control, about identity, about the understanding that the position he believed defined him could be altered without his permission. And Malcolm watched him for a moment longer before speaking again, his voice steady, almost quiet enough to miss if the room had not been completely still. "This was never about destroying you," he said. "It was about showing you what happens when you dismiss what you do not understand." And Jonathan did not respond this time, because there was nothing left to challenge, nothing left to deny, only the reality unfolding in front of him, and the realization that the man he had chosen to ignore had seen everything from the very beginning. For a moment, nothing else was said. And that silence did not feel empty. It felt full, dense with everything that had just been revealed and everything that could no longer be undone. And Malcolm Rhodes stood there without moving, without pressing further, because he understood something that most people in that room did not, that the most powerful moments are not the ones filled with words, but the ones where truth settles in and forces people to confront what they have done. And Jonathan Pierce felt that now in a way he had never experienced before. Not as pressure from outside forces, but as a realization forming inside his own mind, replaying the moment again and again, the extended hand, the deliberate refusal, the dismissive turn, a decision made in seconds that had now expanded into consequences measured in billions. And he closed his eyes briefly, not out of weakness, but out of calculation, as if stepping away for even a fraction of a second might help him find a path back. But when he opened them again, the room was still the same. The alerts were still coming, and Malcolm was still standing there, unchanged, unaffected, steady in a way that made everything else feel unstable by comparison. And across the table, one of the executives spoke quietly, almost to himself. "This is real." And that simple statement carried more weight than any analysis could, because it confirmed what everyone had already begun to accept, that this was not a scenario they could reason their way out of, it was a reality they had to face. And Sophie Lynn finally exhaled, her fingers resting still on her tablet, because she no longer needed to verify anything. The system had already made its position clear, and her eyes moved again to Malcolm, not with curiosity now, but with recognition, the kind that comes when someone realizes they are in the presence of a level of authority they had only read about. And Jonathan shifted slightly, his posture no longer defensive, no longer performative, but grounded in something more honest, something closer to understanding. And when he spoke again, his voice carried none of the sharpness it had before. "Why now?" he asked. And the question was not about timing. Not really. It was about cause, about the connection between a single moment and a massive outcome. And Malcolm considered it for a second, not because he needed to think, but because he chose his words carefully, not to escalate, not to humiliate, but to clarify. "It was always going to happen," he said. "The structure was already there." And Jonathan frowned slightly, trying to follow, and Malcolm continued. "You built a system that responds to hierarchy, to control, to who has access at the highest level." He said, "Today, you showed me exactly where you placed me in that hierarchy." And the meaning landed without resistance, because it did not require interpretation. It was direct, undeniable. And Jonathan looked down again, not at his phone this time, but at the table itself, at the surface where everything had started, and for the first time, the realization was complete, not partial, not forming, but fully understood, that this was not just about financial systems or corporate leverage. It was about perception, about the assumptions he had made, the way he had evaluated someone in an instant without seeking any deeper understanding. And Malcolm watched him with the same calm presence, not seeking acknowledgement, not demanding apology, because the lesson had already been delivered, not through confrontation, but through consequence. And after a few seconds, Malcolm spoke again, his voice softer now, but no less precise. "Power does not always look like what you expect," he said. "Sometimes it looks like someone you decide to ignore." And no one in the room moved, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to add, only the reality that had already reshaped everything they thought they knew. The numbers did not stop, and that was the part no one could ignore anymore, because even after the realization settled, even after the truth had been spoken out loud in a room that had gone completely still, the system continued to move, steady, precise, indifferent to emotion. And Jonathan Pierce stood there watching it happen in real time, no longer trying to interrupt it, no longer trying to rationalize it, because the scale had moved beyond explanation and into consequence. And across the table, one of the executives slowly sat back down, not because the meeting had resumed, but because standing no longer made sense in a room where control had already been redefined. And Sophie Lynn glanced at the central dashboard again, just once, and what she saw confirmed everything Malcolm had implied: layers of liquidation cascading across interconnected accounts, each one linked through structures that had once given Jonathan leverage but were now amplifying his exposure. And she understood now that this was not destruction for the sake of power, it was precision, a system responding exactly as it had been designed to when authority shifted at the highest level. And Malcolm Rhodes remained where he was, not moving forward, not stepping back, simply allowing the process to complete itself, because intervention was no longer necessary. The outcome was already determined. And Jonathan finally lowered his phone completely, letting it rest against the table as if holding onto it any longer would only delay what he already knew. And when he looked up again, his expression had changed once more, not into acceptance, not fully, but into awareness, the kind that comes when someone understands that a moment cannot be undone, only remembered. And his voice, when it came, was quieter than before, but clearer. "How far does it go?" he asked. And this time there was no defiance in the question, only a need to understand the boundaries of what had already begun. And Malcolm met his gaze without hesitation. "As far as your structure allows," he said, and that answer carried more weight than any number on the screen, because it meant there was no external limit, no arbitrary stopping point, only the full extent of what Jonathan himself had built, now turning inward, now responding to a level of control he had failed to recognize, and the room absorbed that truth in silence. Each person recalculating not just the situation, but their own assumptions, their own understanding of where power truly lived. And one of the partners finally spoke, his voice careful, measured. "This affects more than just him," he said, not as a challenge, but as a statement of concern. And Malcolm turned slightly, acknowledging the point without dismissing it. "Systems are connected," he replied. "That is what makes them efficient." And the implication was clear: efficiency carries risk, and risk does not discriminate once it is activated. And Jonathan exhaled slowly, running a hand across his face as if trying to process not just the financial impact, but the realization behind it. And for the first time since the meeting began, he did not look at Malcolm with dismissal or resistance, but with a form of recognition, incomplete but undeniable. And Malcolm held that moment without pushing it further, because recognition does not need to be forced. It arrives when there is nothing left to deny. And after a few seconds, Malcolm spoke again, his voice steady, almost reflective. "This was never hidden," he said. "It was always there, in the structure, in the access, in the way everything connects." And Jonathan nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in understanding. Because he could see it now, the full picture, the architecture he had trusted, the pathways he had relied on, all of it leading back to a point he had overlooked. And Malcolm finished, not with emphasis, not with triumph, but with finality. "You just never looked closely enough to see who was holding it together." And in that moment, no one in the room questioned it, because the proof was no longer abstract. It was unfolding right in front of them, line by line, account by account, until there was nothing left to misunderstand. By now, the room no longer felt like a place where decisions were made. It felt like a place where consequences arrived, and Jonathan Pierce stood at the center of it without the authority he had carried just minutes earlier, watching as the final layers of his structure continued to unwind with quiet precision, each update on the screen no longer surprising, only confirming what he had already accepted. And around him, the executives who had once aligned with his confidence now kept their distance, not physically, but in posture, in silence, in the way they no longer looked to him for direction, because direction had already shifted. And Malcolm Rhodes remained exactly where he had been, composed, steady, not expanding into the space, but filling it completely through presence alone. And for the first time since the meeting began, no one questioned why he was there, no one wondered who he was, because the system had answered that more clearly than any introduction could have. And Jonathan finally spoke again, not to challenge, not to negotiate, but to understand something deeper than the numbers. "You could have told me," he said, and the statement carried a quiet weight, not as an excuse, but as a reflection of what might have changed if the moment had gone differently. And Malcolm considered it briefly before responding, his tone unchanged. "I gave you the opportunity," he said, and Jonathan's brow tightened slightly, confusion flickering before recognition followed, because he understood now that the opportunity had not been a conversation, not a title, not a formal introduction. It had been something far simpler, something most people overlook because it feels too small to matter. A gesture, a moment of acknowledgement, a handshake, and the realization settled fully this time, deeper than before, because it reframed everything, not just what had happened in this room, but how easily it could have been different. And Jonathan let out a slow breath, his gaze dropping for a second before returning to Malcolm, and there was no defiance left in it now, no attempt to reassert control, only the awareness that he had misjudged something fundamental. And across the table, Sophie Lynn watched quietly, her expression no longer uncertain, no longer searching, but resolved, because she had just witnessed something few people ever see firsthand, the exact moment when perceived power collapses and real power reveals itself without effort. And Malcolm shifted slightly, not to leave, not yet, but to signal that what needed to be said had already been said. And when he spoke again, it was not directed only at Jonathan, but at the room itself, at everyone who had been present, everyone who had watched without intervening. "Respect is not a strategy," he said, his voice calm but carrying through the silence. "It is the baseline that everything else depends on." and no one interrupted. Because there was nothing to interrupt, no argument to make, no perspective to offer that would change what had already unfolded, and Jonathan nodded once, almost imperceptibly, not in agreement, but in acceptance of the reality he now faced, and Malcolm's gaze moved across the room briefly, acknowledging each person without judgment, without accusation, just recognition, before returning to Jonathan one last time. "You did not lose control today," he said. "You revealed that you never had it." And the words settled with a finality that did not need emphasis, because the proof was still visible on every screen, in every notification, in every quiet realization that had replaced the confidence that once filled the room. And for the first time since it all began, no one looked away. The room remained still, but it was no longer the stillness of tension. It was the stillness of aftermath, the kind that settles in only after something irreversible has already taken place. And Jonathan Pierce stood there without reaching for his phone this time, without checking the screen, because he no longer needed confirmation. He already knew. The sequence had completed. The structure had done exactly what it was designed to do, and across the table, one by one, people began to sit down. Again, not because the meeting was continuing, but because standing no longer made sense in a room where everything had already changed, and the energy had shifted completely, no longer centered around projections or deals or influence, but around understanding, and Malcolm Rhodes stood at the center of that understanding without moving, without claiming anything, because there was nothing left to claim. The system had already spoken on his behalf, and Jonathan finally looked around the room. Really looked this time, at the people who had aligned with him, who had laughed when he dismissed Malcolm, who had followed his lead without question, and now none of them spoke, none of them offered support, because power does not stay where it no longer belongs. It shifts, quietly, completely, and he nodded once, a small motion, almost to himself, as if acknowledging something internal that had taken longer to surface than the numbers on the screen. And when he spoke again, his voice carried none of the performance it had before, only clarity. "I misjudged you," he said, and the words were simple, but they landed differently than anything else he had said, because they were not strategic, not defensive, they were real, and Malcolm met his gaze without hesitation, not softening, not hardening, just present, because acknowledgement does not erase consequence, it only clarifies it. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them no longer defined by tension, but by truth. And Sophie Lynn watched quietly, her posture now steady, her expression thoughtful, because what she had witnessed was more than a shift in power. It was a correction, a realignment of how power is perceived versus how it actually operates. And Malcolm finally moved, just slightly, enough to signal that the moment had reached its natural end. And when he spoke again, his voice was calm, measured, but carried something deeper now, not just authority, but resolution. "This was never personal," he said, "but it was necessary." And Jonathan nodded again, slower this time, because he understood what that meant, that this was not retaliation driven by emotion, but a response driven by structure, by a system that had been triggered not by anger, but by a breach of something more fundamental. And Malcolm glanced briefly at the screens around the room, at the final confirmations, the completed sequences, the stabilized outputs that followed the collapse, and then back at Jonathan. "The system is stabilizing now," he said, not as reassurance, but as information, and Jonathan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Because even in loss, there is a point where uncertainty ends and reality becomes fixed. And Malcolm took one final look around the room, acknowledging the silence, the shift, the understanding that had replaced everything that came before. And then he said, quietly, but with absolute clarity, "Next time, do not wait for proof to show respect." And the words did not echo. They did not need to. They settled exactly where they were meant to, in a room full of people who would not forget what they had just seen. And for the first time since the meeting began, Malcolm Rhodes turned to leave, not because he had won, but because there was nothing left to prove. Malcolm Rhodes did not rush as he walked toward the door, because there was nothing left in the room that required urgency, no decision to chase, no argument to win, only a quiet shift that had already taken hold and would continue long after he left. And behind him, the boardroom remained still, not frozen, but recalibrating, every person present now sitting with the weight of what they had just witnessed. A moment that had started with something so small it could have been dismissed, and ended with something so precise it could not be ignored. And Jonathan Pierce remained where he was, no longer at the head of the room, no longer directing attention, but standing among the same people who had once followed him without hesitation, now aware that the structure he had relied on had not just failed him, it had revealed him. And he looked down at the table again, not at the numbers, not at the data, but at the space where Malcolm's hand had once been extended, a moment now replaying, with clarity instead of assumption. And for the first time, he understood the difference between presence and position, between authority that is assigned and authority that is inherent. And across the room, one of the senior executives finally spoke, not loudly, not to challenge, but to acknowledge what everyone already knew. "We need to reassess everything," he said, and no one disagreed. Because reassessment was no longer optional, it was necessary, not just in terms of strategy or capital, but in how they perceived the people in front of them, how they measured value, how quickly they formed conclusions based on incomplete information. And Sophie Lynn closed her tablet slowly, not because her work was done, but because she understood that what she had just seen would shape every decision she made moving forward. And her eyes followed Malcolm as he reached the door, not with curiosity, but with a quiet respect that had not been present when he first entered. And Malcolm paused for just a fraction of a second before stepping out, not turning back, not seeking acknowledgement, because acknowledgement had already been established, not through words, but through consequence. And the door closed softly behind him, a sound that marked the end of the moment, but not the end of its impact. And inside the room, Jonathan finally sat down, slowly, deliberately, as if the act itself required more awareness than before, and he placed his phone on the table without looking at it, because the numbers no longer needed to be watched to be understood. And for a long moment, no one spoke, not out of discomfort, but out of reflection, each person processing the same realization from a different angle. That power is not always visible, not always announced, and often misunderstood by those who rely too heavily on appearances. And Jonathan leaned back slightly, his gaze unfocused for a second before settling again. And when he spoke, it was not to regain control, not to explain, but simply to state what had become undeniable. "We missed it," he said, and the simplicity of the statement carried through the room with more weight than any presentation ever could, because it was not just about missing a person, it was about missing the structure, the connection, the reality that had been present the entire time. And no one corrected him, because there was nothing to correct, only a shared understanding that would not be forgotten, not in this room, not in any room they would walk into after this, because once you have seen power reveal itself without asking, you do not mistake it again. Outside the boardroom, the hallway felt different, quieter, not because of the absence of noise, but because of the clarity Malcolm Rhodes carried with him as he walked, each step measured, unhurried, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. And in a way, for him, it had not, because moments like that were not about surprise, they were about alignment, about systems responding exactly as they were built to respond. And he adjusted his cuff slightly as he reached the elevator, the polished steel doors reflecting back the same composed figure who had entered that room minutes earlier, unchanged in posture, unchanged in expression, because true power does not need to transform itself to be recognized. It simply waits until it is revealed. And as the elevator doors opened, he stepped inside without looking back, not out of indifference, but because there was nothing behind him that required revisiting. The lesson had already been delivered, not through force, not through confrontation, but through precision. And inside the boardroom, the silence lingered longer than anyone expected, not awkward, not uncertain, but reflective, each person sitting with the weight of what they had seen. And Jonathan Pierce remained seated at the table, his hands resting still, no longer gripping his phone, no longer reacting to updates, because the movement had stopped. The system had completed its process, leaving behind a reality that could not be undone, only understood. And he looked up slowly, his gaze moving across the room, meeting the eyes of people who had once mirrored his confidence, and now reflected something else entirely, awareness. And he nodded once, not as a signal, not as a command, but as acknowledgement of a shift that had already taken place. and Sophie Lynn gathered her tablet quietly, her movements deliberate, thoughtful, because what she carried with her now was more than data, it was perspective, the kind that changes how you enter every room from that point forward, and one by one, the others followed, not speaking much, not needing to, because some lessons do not require discussion to be remembered, they imprint themselves in silence. And as the room slowly emptied, Jonathan remained seated for a moment longer, his eyes resting on the table where everything had begun, and in that stillness, the final understanding settled, not about loss, not about numbers, but about perception, about the cost of assuming you understand someone before you do. And he finally stood, slower than before, more deliberate, and as he walked toward the door, he paused briefly, his hand hovering near the handle before he spoke quietly, almost to himself. Next time, I will know better. And the words were not a promise to anyone else. They were a recognition of something internal that had shifted, something that would follow him into every room from now on. And somewhere down the hall, the elevator doors closed as Malcolm Rhodes continued on, not looking for recognition, not expecting acknowledgement, because he had never needed either, and the truth remained simple, clear, and impossible to ignore. Respect is not something you give after proof. It is something you give before, because sometimes the person you underestimate is the one holding everything together, and by the time you realize it, the system has already responded.